An emperor once cut his sleeve rather than disturb his sleeping male lover. And that moment changed Chinese history forever. You've probably never heard that in a classroom. But in ancient China, same-sex love wasn't just tolerated in some dynasties. It was woven into palace life poetry and politics. Male concubines held titles. Scholars exchanged love letters. And emperors didn't always love their empresses. So why did this all vanish from our textbooks? Who buried these stories, and what do they reveal about power culture and the fluidity of love itself? Drop a comment. With the time you're watching this, I'm always curious when my fellow history seekers tune in. And hey, if you enjoy uncovering the stories that history tried to forget, subscribing is totally up to you. But we go deep here, and it's about to get fascinating. Let's begin. You step softly over lacquered floors, the scent of sandalwood thick in the air, as golden lanterns cast flickering shadows across the silk-draped corridors of the Han Imperial Palace. It's late, but this place never really sleeps, especially not the private chambers of the Son of Heaven. Here in the hush of candlelight, power is more than military conquests and trade agreements. It's intimacy. It's who gets invited to the emperor's bed when the officials leave and the court musicians quiet their flutes. You don't need to squint to notice something unusual. The face beside the emperor, rouged, soft, and serene, isn't that of an empress or concubine. It's a young man. His silk robe gleams just as richly. His movements are just as practiced. He bows not with fear, but with familiarity. And if you stayed a little longer, you'd realize the emperor's hand never really leaves his shoulder. Welcome to the court of Emperor Ai of Han, and that man with the painted brows. That's Dong Xian, general favorite and lover. It's not a hidden secret. Not really. Whispered about, yes, but suppressed. Not yet. In fact, during this time in Chinese history, male companionship, intimate or romantic, wasn't seen with the same scandalous eyes we might expect. Power was fluid. Roles could bend. And affection between men, especially among the elite, wasn't a matter of public outrage so much as it was a matter of who benefited from it. And believe me, Dong Xian benefited. At one point, the young man rose to the rank of commander of the armed forces, all within just a few short years of sharing the emperor's bed. You can almost hear the side eyes from the older ministers. Imagine them muttering over their scrolls, pretending to cough whenever Dong Xian's name was brought up. But no one dared question the emperor's taste, at least not out loud, because to accuse the emperor of inappropriate love was to accuse heaven itself of poor judgment. And that could cost you your head. And so, the palace became a place of subtle glances and careful alliances. The love between Emperor Ai and Dong Xian was the stuff of poetry, literally. Later, writers would craft verses about their closeness, their whispered conversations under moonlight, their silk sleeves brushing in passing. These weren't fantasy embellishments. They were recordings of what the court already knew, but politely danced around. The emperor didn't hide his affection. He let it bloom. Now, does that mean ancient China was some kind of LGBTQ plus utopia? Not quite. There were still expectations, especially tied to family marriage and Confucian duty. You were expected to marry a woman, produce heirs, carry on the ancestral line. But who you shared your secrets and your nights with, that was negotiable, especially if you were wearing a dragon-embroidered robe and held the mandate of heaven. You might be wondering, was this really unique to Emperor Ai? Not at all. Many emperors throughout Chinese history had male favorites. Some relationships were fleeting, others lasting. Some were romantic, others strategic. And in many cases, the boundaries between love and politics blurred like ink on damp rice paper. The inner courts of ancient China were not merely spaces for feminine beauty and submission. They were arenas of influence. And young men, handsome, educated, often skilled in music or poetry, were sometimes brought into the harem not as guards, but as honored companions. While later dynasties might erase them from official records, you can still catch glimpses in poetry, collections, private memoirs, and scandalized side notes in old court documents. And here's something to chew on. Imagine the modern reaction if a sitting president publicly promoted his male partner to lead the military. Scandal protest, think pieces. Yet in the Han Dynasty, it happened, and though it was controversial, it didn't collapse the empire. The drama only unfolded when the emperor died young, and Dongxian, suddenly without protection, was pushed into a corner from which he never escaped. So as you walk through the jade-inlaid halls and watch history shimmer under candlelight, ask yourself this: how many stories have we buried under the polite lie that love always looked the same, sounded the same, belonged to the same two kinds of people? You don't need modern words for what existed long before modern labels. You just need the willingness to look where the footnotes blush. You probably noticed the emperor's sleeve earlier, how it trailed delicately across the bed before he laid down next to Dongxian. That right there is the quiet beginning of a legend. Because one morning, as the story goes, Emperor Ai awoke to find his favorite still asleep, resting peacefully across his robe. Rather than disturb him, the emperor took a knife and sliced off the end of his own sleeve. A gesture so tender, so deliberate, that generations would remember it as Duan Xiu, the cut sleeve. It's a phrase that still lingers today, tucked discreetly into Chinese literature and idioms. When someone refers to passions of the cut sleeve, they're not talking about a tailoring accident. They're talking about love between men. And not in a scolding tone either. It's almost poetic, as if the very language agreed to preserve that moment in silk and memory. But before you get too romantic about it, remember, this wasn't always just about love. It was also about favor power and proximity to the throne. To share the emperor's bed meant more than physical closeness. It meant access sometimes to entire ministries, to appointments, to titles. Dongxian, for example, didn't rise because of military genius. He rose because love and politics were tangled vines climbing the same marble column. Still, it's unfair to assume every emperor's favorite was a schemer. Many were just there. Young men chosen for their looks, their talent, their grace. The palace scouted them the way today's agencies might scout a model. Good posture check, clear skin check, can play the guqin without making it screech, you're in. Take the case of Han Dynasty Emperor Cheng. He favored a man named Zhang Fang, and while records are murkier than those about Dongxian court whispers, suggest a similar closeness. But here's the twist. These relationships weren't always shameful. Sure, they raised eyebrows, but they weren't automatically condemned. Not until later, when Confucian moralists started scrubbing the records with judgment-heavy brushes. Now, would these stories have survived if they'd happened between commoners? Probably not. History has a funny way of preserving the romances of the rich and powerful while letting the rest dissolve like ink in water. That's part of what makes the cut sleeve tale so special. It's personal, yes, but it also echoes through official records, poems, plays, and commentaries. The bureaucracy of the empire couldn't resist writing everything down, even love. Which brings us to a cheeky thought. Can you imagine slicing off a designer blazer sleeve just to avoid waking someone you adore? It's kind of absurd, and also kind of beautiful. It wasn't about the garment. It was about the softness, the sacrifice, the unspoken permission to rest. In a court full of rigid rules where people bowed so often they probably had back problems that moment, the cut sleeve was rebellion in the gentlest form. And somehow, even centuries later, you can still feel it every time the phrase slips into poetry or quiet conversation. Every time a historian dusts off an archive and wonders why this general got promoted so quickly. Every time a drama series subtly hints at what official textbooks refuse to spell out. But this moment wasn't just about Dong Xian. It set the stage. After all, once one emperor made his favorite, a legend other courtiers, maybe even future emperors, took note. Love could be dangerous, but it could also be a ladder. And the robe. It wasn't just silk. It was a symbol. So the next time someone tries to tell you, ancient love was always about arranged marriages and duty-bound heirs, remind them of the emperor who sliced silk instead of stirring someone he loved. Not with speeches, not with declarations, just one quiet gesture in a palace full of noise. You leave behind the palace corridors still echoing with the rustle of silk and step into quieter gardens, places where words matter more than robes. Here, beneath curved rooftops and moonlit pavilions, another kind of intimacy blooms. It's not declared in edicts or whispered in bedchambers. It's carved into bamboo slips, scribbled onto scrolls, and folded into poems passed between scholars like secret gifts. You find yourself sitting beside two men, dressed in scholars' robes, their fingers stained with ink, their conversation drifting between philosophy and verse. These are the literati, the Confucian-educated elite masters of calligraphy, tea ceremony, and nuanced emotion. And among them, romantic affection between men often found its purest, most artful form. Take Pan Zhang and Wang Zhongxian, for instance, two scholars whose devotion to each other was so renowned that they were, according to some accounts, buried together under a tree whose branches intertwined above their graves. Whether or not the tree part is embroidered over time, and let's be honest, it probably is. The affection they shared was admired enough to make it into literary collections, not erased, not shamed. Admired. And then there's the poetry, so much poetry. Ancient Chinese verse is already drenched in melancholy and longing, but when you realize many of those aching couplets were directed not toward distant maidens, but toward fellow men, everything shifts. A line, like your image lingers on my pillow, suddenly hums with different electricity. And the beauty of it, they rarely had to say it outright. The language was so metaphorical, so layered, that a scholar could confess his love in 10 lines of mountain imagery, and only another scholar would know. In a way, this scholar-to-scholar connection was safer than court romance. No political rivalries. No jealous wives demanding punishment. Just shared intellect, shared loneliness, shared firelight over scrolls. And of course, plenty of plausible deniability. You're just exchanging verse, right? Just admiring each other's calligraphy. This quiet form of companionship was so common that it even had its own aesthetic ideal, nanfeng, or the southern custom. In some regions, particularly around the Jiangnan area, male-male relationships were considered not just acceptable, but refined, elegant, as if loving a fellow man was a mark of cultural sophistication, like knowing your wines or quoting Laozi without checking your notes. Of course, not everyone agreed. Confucianism still loomed large, and filial piety, that all-important concept of honoring your family by producing heirs, remained a heavy counterbalance. But for those who already had wives, children, and a steady job, there was room for something more poetic, something quieter, something shared on moon-viewing nights when the family was asleep and the ink was still wet. Now, imagine modern university dorms, but instead of late-night gaming and takeout, it's two roommates reading each other poetry under candlelight and composing joint essays about the Tao. It sounds impossibly romantic and maybe a little like an art film, but that's part of the point. Romance wasn't always about physicality. It was about recognition, seeing another mind, and feeling understood. And isn't that still the dream? Even now, buried under apps and awkward first dates, people still want to be seen. Still want someone who gets their metaphors without needing an explanation. Still want that feeling that their silence isn't empty, it's shared. You slip through the stone archways of a walled compound, now away from emperors and scholars, into the quieter world of aristocratic households. Here beyond the polished courtyards and carved wooden screens, another layer of ancient life hums, less documented, but no less intimate. You might not see robes being cut or verses exchanged under moonlight, but behind these closed courtyards, affection still stirred between sons of noble families and the companions they were never supposed to outgrow. You watch as two boys, one the son of a respected official, the other his longtime page spar, with wooden swords beneath the ginkgo trees. It starts like play, but the glances linger a second too long. The touch of a shoulder lasts half a heartbeat more than it needs to, and when the training ends, they don't part ways. They vanish into the shaded hall to share a plate of dumplings and talk about nothing in particular, in the way only people who've known each other since childhood can. That page, he won't show up in the family genealogy. His name won't be carved onto ancestral tablets. But in the household's quiet rhythms, he's as constant as a shadow. He pours tea during ancestor worship. He folds the master's robes. He sleeps just outside his door. And sometimes, depending on the family's tolerance or their ability to pretend not to notice, he stays, even after boyhood ends. Now, these relationships were rarely spoken of directly. After all, Confucian ideals weren't just philosophical, they were household law. Marry a woman, produce heirs, carry the bloodline forward. But for elite young men who had time, money, and status to buffer them from scrutiny, there was often space carved out between the lines of duty, little emotional alcoves where something softer could exist. And in many cases, these young men did marry. They followed protocol, raised families, and attended rituals just like they were supposed to. But the real closeness, the person they leaned on, the one who helped them through sleepless nights or hard decisions, was often not their wife, but their male companion. That's the part history keeps tucked between the lines. Not quite scandalous enough to write about. Not quite ordinary enough to ignore. What makes this even more fascinating is how often it was tolerated. Quietly, of course. Respectable families knew how to look the other way, as long as no public dishonor was brought, and the family name stayed intact. Much like certain family dinners today, where everyone knows Uncle Gene brings his friend every year, and no one dares question it, as long as dessert gets served on time. In some households, the affection between master and companion was even used as leverage. Parents might pressure their son's companion to persuade him toward marriage or politics. Talk to him, they'd say. He listens to you. And they were right. In households run like tiny kingdoms, love wasn't just an emotion, it was influence. The tension, of course, came when feelings outlasted their usefulness. If the young master grew too fond, or the companion too ambitious, it upset the delicate balance. Sometimes the companion was sent away. Sometimes he was married off to someone else. Sometimes, rarely, he was simply kept quietly, respectfully, and forever present in the background of official family portraits he was never allowed to be in. Which makes you wonder how many grand old family homes held stories like these folded between silk quilts and sandalwood boxes. How many perfectly arranged ancestral halls sat just a few feet from a room where someone once whispered something forbidden but true. You slip through the painted doors of a city tea house now, but not just any tea house. This one hums with gongs, giddy chatter, and the flutter of embroidered fans. You're in an opera house somewhere in the heart of a Tang or Ming Dynasty city, where the seats are packed, the incense is thick, and all eyes are on the stage. But tonight, it's not just the performance stealing glances, it's the performer. A man stands beneath the stage light's face painted in delicate strokes, robes shimmering with embroidered clouds. His movements are fluid, precise, hypnotic. He plays a woman flawlessly. So flawlessly, in fact, that a few spectators in the front row might be blushing. He's not just acting, he's embodying something people can't look away from. Welcome to the world of non-don male opera performers who specialized in female roles. In a time when women were often barred from public stages, these men became the embodiment of feminine grace, sorrow, seduction, and loyalty. And offstage, well, let's just say, admiration didn't always stop at the curtain call. You glance around the audience and notice it's not just young theatergoers enthralled. Wealthy patrons, city magistrates, even retired scholars sit a little straighter when that particular performer enters. Flowers are delivered backstage. Private boxes are booked weeks in advance. One nobleman sends a poem instead of money, a risky move depending on the line breaks. These performers walked a delicate line, revered for their artistry, yes, but also desired for the androgyny they carried with such confidence. Their voices could haunt you, their eyes could unravel you, and their real lives, often far more complicated than the roles they played. Some were kept by patrons, housed in private residences like precious instruments. Others were independent fiercely, so crafting reputations not just for performance, but for wit and charm. And many faced scorn from moralists who accused them of corrupting youth or blurring gender boundaries that Confucian codes worked so hard to keep in place. But the truth was, this opera was its own universe. A space where rules melted, identities shifted, and attraction wasn't always concerned with gender, it was about performance, presence, charisma. These men didn't just portray desire, they generated it. Consider Wei Changsheng, a famous Qing dynasty performer, whose popularity sparked genuine social panic. His beauty, it was said, caused public disturbances. Admirers fought over him in the streets. Some even accused him of using sorcery, which, let's be honest, is what you say when someone's too charming and you're out of arguments. The state eventually banned him from Beijing, but banning someone for being too alluring, that's just another way of admitting they were impossible to ignore. You might be tempted to compare this to modern celebrities, the K-pop idols with flawless features and gender-fluid aesthetics. And in some ways, you wouldn't be wrong. the same breathless fandom, the same carefully cultivated image, the same invisible line between admiration and obsession. But back then, there was something even riskier at play. These weren't just entertainers. They were living paradoxes, men who embodied femininity so convincingly that the very foundations of social roles shook a little. And when they stepped off stage, they often didn't step far from the roles they played. Of course, not all relationships between patrons and performers were romantic. Some were strictly professional. But others left behind rumors, letters, and verses that suggest something deeper. A shared night, a private gift, a confession made over rice wine in the early hours. So as you watch the performer bow at the end of the scene, one sleeve lifted eyes, lowered just enough to break hearts. Remember, that stage wasn't the only place drama played out. In the opera house, art was never just art. It was invitation. It was tension. It was a mirror. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it was love in disguise. You leave behind the silk curtains and stage lights and step into the alleys, now narrow, sun-bleached and thick with the smells of sweat dumplings and the occasional whiff of something best not identified. Here in the bustle of the commoner's world, love doesn't wear brocade or speak in couplets. It wears straw sandals and knows how to make eye contact without getting caught. You pass by porters unloading fish vendors yelling over prices and farmers rolling up their sleeves to count copper coins. It would be easy to assume that nothing queer or romantic stirred here among muddy hems and aching backs. But you'd be wrong. You just have to know where to look. In these winding market lanes, male companionship existed, not in poetry, but in practice. Roommates, co-workers, drinking partners. Sometimes it was just convenience, two men sharing rent-splitting chores, watching each other's backs. But sometimes it wasn't just that. Sometimes a glance lingered longer than the price of cabbage could explain. Sometimes two unmarried men lived together well into middle age, and no one asked why, at least not out loud. Unlike the palace where records were obsessively kept, or the scholar's world where emotion could hide behind metaphor, the lives of peasants rarely made it into scrolls. But folk songs, local legends, and even fragments of legal cases suggest that affection between men was part of this world too. Just whispered, not written. Take the story of Liu and Meng, two market workers from a southern town who, according to oral tradition, built a house together outside the village. They grew vegetables. They sold buns. They died just a few years apart. Was it love? No one wrote it down, but the locals called them husbands long after they were gone. Not mockingly, just matter of fact. In many rural places where labor was hard and social surveillance lighter than in Confucian households, people had a strange way of looking the other way as long as things got done. As long as fields were plowed and taxes paid, who you spent your nights with wasn't always anyone else's business. In fact, same-sex pairings among men may have been more tolerated in these contexts than we assume, especially in port towns, mining settlements, or remote regions where families didn't always live nearby to enforce proper expectations. It's here that modern comparisons get a little sharper. Think of today's urban roommates who slowly realize they're more than just friends, or long-haul truck drivers who always seem to ride in pairs, sharing playlists and secrets across endless highways. Same rhythm, different era. Of course, there were risks. If affection between men became too obvious, too flamboyant, or too boastful, it could attract unwanted attention. Moral panic didn't only belong to scholars. Every village had its gossips, and every town had a magistrate who might decide someone's lifestyle needed correction. public shaming, forced marriages, in rare cases, imprisonment. Not because of formal bans. China didn't have blanket laws against homosexuality in ancient times, but because deviation from norms made people nervous. Still, people found their ways through coded words, through gestures, through loyalty that didn't need labels. Two men might pledge themselves to each other, not with rings, but by sharing a plot of land, by saving each other's rice during hard years, by growing old together in a world that didn't care to record them, but couldn't erase them either. You walk now into a quieter chamber, not a garden, not a stage, not a bustling alley. This one smells like parchment and candle wax. Your feet echo against stone as you step into the halls of law, where scrolls are stacked like bricks and magistrates squint at ink with the same suspicion they reserve for rumors. If love in the palace wore silk and love in the alleys wore dust here in the legal records, it wears fog. Because here's the twist. Ancient China, for much of its imperial history, didn't have an explicit law banning homosexuality. Yes, really. No article in the Tang Code, no paragraph in the Qing statutes outright criminalized consensual same-sex relationships between adult men. Which sounds progressive until you realize what they did instead. They danced around it, dodged it, regulated behaviors that hinted at it without naming it. Laws about licentious conduct, vague clauses about depraved customs, clauses that didn't say what they meant but punished anyway. It was less like being arrested for who you loved and more like being arrested for how uncomfortable your happiness made someone else feel. Take, for instance, a case from the Ming Dynasty involving two male servants who were caught in an intimate relationship. The court didn't punish them for the relationship itself, but for disturbing household harmony. That's how the law worked. It didn't need to name desire to suppress it. It just had to frame it as a disruption. And yet, there were still loopholes, especially in the earlier dynasties, when Confucian order hadn't yet fused so tightly with governance. In some places, same-sex pairings were acknowledged with mild amusement, especially if the men were discreet and fulfilled their duties otherwise. After all, if a man respected his parents, performed rituals, paid his taxes, and didn't cause social disorder, who cared if his best friend was always around? But as time marched on, and as Neo-Confucianism gained stronger hold during the Song and Ming periods, the screws tightened. Morality became law. Law became morality. And affection between men was increasingly framed not just as inappropriate, but as a sign of social decay. The state didn't need a statute to be oppressive. All it needed was cultural consensus. You might see echoes of this today, places where no law is written, but the pressure is thicker than ink, where you're technically free, but also technically watched, where silence is safety and visibility is risk. Ancient China's laws might not have spelled it out, but the consequences could still be sharp. And this is where the records become ghosts. So many lives touched by scrutiny but never clearly named. Men dismissed from court service without reason. Local officials demoted after scandalous rumors. Monks exiled from temples after someone whispered too loudly about a close disciple. Still, the legal silence also offered room. In times and regions where local officials were less moralistic, relationships bloomed in the cracks of the law. There were even stories of men drawing up informal contracts, vows of partnership, joint property burial requests. Not legal marriages, of course, but gestures of commitment that the law couldn't recognize, but also didn't always punish. One Qing-era case mentions two men who built a shrine together in the mountains and left behind inscriptions referring to their shared life and death. The local magistrate visited once, frowned, but did nothing. Maybe he thought it was eccentric. Maybe he understood. Maybe he just didn't want the paperwork. So as you skim these brittle scrolls, squinting at faded brushstrokes and wondering how much history was lost between the lines, a quiet question forms. How many truths did the law erase, not by forbidding them, but by refusing to acknowledge they ever existed? You leave behind the city courts now and begin climbing step by step into the mountains. The air thins. The trees lean in. Somewhere above, a bell rings faintly across the valley. You're heading toward a monastery, stone-built, incense-scented, and serenely indifferent to the bustle of the world below. But behind its high walls and chants lies yet another layer of the untold, the quiet intimacy between monks. It starts perhaps with shared labor. Two young initiates sweeping the courtyard at dawn, their breath visible in the cold. They're silent mostly. One finishes the other's sentence with a nod. No poetry, no grand declarations, just rhythm. Shared chores become shared prayers. Shared prayers become shared meals. And sometimes shared silence becomes something heavier than devotion. Buddhist monastic life, at least on paper, demanded celibacy and the renunciation of all worldly desires. But human beings are never just paper. In practice, monasteries across China, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, became spaces where close emotional bonds between men could form with a depth that outsiders rarely witnessed, and even more rarely understood. Sometimes the love stayed spiritual. Sometimes it didn't. And sometimes no one could tell the difference. In some temple records, you'll find coded language, intimate friendship, inseparable brothers, companions in the Dharma. Occasionally, stories appear of elder monks taking younger disciples under their wing, not just as mentors, but as partners in meditation philosophy, and possibly more. There were cases, even of monks, requesting to be buried beside a certain companion, just like lovers in other parts of society. These were not casual friendships. These were lifelong. Now Buddhist texts themselves often wrestled with desire. Monks wrote scrolls about temptation, guilt dreams that wouldn't go away. But some also wrote with surprising tenderness, acknowledging that affection, when rooted in compassion rather than possession, wasn't always impurity. In some sects, particularly Chan Zen Buddhism, the line between spiritual union and emotional intimacy blurred even further. You might be tempted to ask, did the abbots know? Of course they did. How could they not? When two monks shared chores, robes, and years of quiet companionship, it wasn't exactly subtle. But as with so many things in ancient China, what mattered wasn't always what you did, it was how you did it. As long as discipline was maintained, rituals upheld, and scandals avoided, many abbots preferred not to interfere. Don't ask, don't chant. And monasteries, by their very design, created space for same-gender bonds to flourish. Removed from family expectations, freed from the burden of marriage or inheritance, monks lived in worlds that revolved around brotherhood. Love, even when forbidden, found a way to rest among the sutras. That said, not every story had a peaceful ending. In certain periods, especially under stricter Confucian influence, temples came under scrutiny. Accusations of misconduct, particularly involving younger novices, could lead to expulsions or even punishment by local officials. Public image mattered, and temples had reputations to protect. A scandal in the mountains could ripple down to the emperor himself. Still, the monks endured. Their stories, though rarely written, plainly linger in temple graffiti and marginalia. on sutra scrolls, in statues that looked just a little more like a portrait of someone they missed. Their companionship wasn't always carnal, but it was always profound. And maybe that's the point. In a world that preached detachment, love still pressed its palms together and bowed quietly in the shadows. You descend from the monastery just as mist begins to curl over the hills, the air heavier now, more weighted, like history itself has started to press down. The songs of poets and secrets of temples begin to fade because you're stepping into a different chapter, one where things grow colder, less poetic, less forgiving. You're entering the age where love once tolerated, or at least cleverly ignored, begins to be reframed as danger. What changed? Not a single moment, but a slow tightening. Like silk cords drawn taut, one knot at a time, starting around the Song dynasty and deepening through the Ming and Qing China's ruling classes, became more committed to Confucian orthodoxy. It wasn't enough to obey your parents and marry properly anymore. Now your very thoughts, gestures, and affections had to align with a set of rigid ideals, ones increasingly suspicious of anything outside the procreative family unit. Male intimacy, once wrapped in poetic mystery or shielded by high status, was increasingly painted as indulgent, wasteful, or even unnatural. The scholar officials who once wrote verses to their male companions now re-edited their anthologies, skipping a few revealing stanzas. The law still didn't officially criminalize same-sex love outright, but society didn't need a written code anymore. It had culture, and culture was often sharper than any sword. You might think of this like the dimming of a lantern. Nothing explodes, but the light goes out just the same. Part of this shift came from fear. Fear of dynastic decline, of moral weakness, of a society seen as soft. The Qing dynasty especially inherited a country shaped by moral campaigns and increasingly influenced by outside pressures. Western traders brought not just goods, but also new ideologies, including Christian notions of morality, that saw same-sex love not as eccentric, but as sinful. And while Imperial China didn't fully absorb these ideas, it certainly flinched under them. Public image became everything. Court eunuchs, once feared and powerful, were now ridiculed in popular novels. Opera performers, who once dazzled audiences, were accused of seducing noblemen and leading sons astray. Gossip became sharper. Laws stayed vague, but punishments got harsher, especially for the lower classes who lacked the wealth or connections to protect themselves. Even literature changed. The subtle love poems between men, fewer and fewer. And when they did appear, they often ended badly. Tragic separations, shame, death. It's as if even fiction lost the courage to imagine a peaceful ending. And yet, love still persisted. In hidden alleys, in locked drawers, in paintings that never made it to public display. Two friends might still build a life together. A scholar might still write a coded poem. But the world no longer pretended not to notice. It noticed and judged. You might think of this era as ancient China's own moral winter. The warmth didn't vanish, but it went underground. Expressions of male-male affection had to be reframed as brotherhood, as loyalty, as tragic longing. Never as love. Never as something whole. It's during this time that even the term duan xiu, the cut sleeve, takes on a slightly different weight. Once whispered with a smile, it's now muttered with a furrowed brow. A story remembered, but often followed by a sigh. Such a shame, someone might say, what happened to Dongxian. And yet, despite this tightening grip, despite the new moralists and imported ideals, The thread was never fully cut. You can still trace it through a letter tucked in a family archive, through a shrine built for two close friends, through the faint echo of an opera line sung with a wink that everyone pretends not to notice. So, as you walk through a Qing-era market square, where paper lanterns glow and suspicion lingers just under the surface, ask yourself, how does something so ancient, so deeply woven into a culture's fabric, ever truly disappear? The truth is it doesn't. It just hides better. You've wandered through palaces, tea houses, mountaintop temples, and the narrow lanes of common life, but now you find yourself back in the present, or at least somewhere close. The lanterns are LED now. The opera house has Wi-Fi. The poems are posted online instead of passed under tables. But something lingers, doesn't it? A thread, worn tangled, but unbroken. You stand in modern China watching as old traditions collide with new identities. Skyscrapers rise where pagodas once stood. Queer film festivals quietly grow in major cities. Young people gather in cafes to read banned poetry out loud. And yes, the phrase duanqiu still gets used, sometimes cheekily, sometimes reverently, always knowingly. It carries centuries inside two characters. Silk, sliced, but never forgotten. And yet the path is still winding. Homosexuality was officially decriminalized in China in 1997. It was removed from the official list of mental disorders in 2001. But laws are only part of the story. Acceptance remains conditional. LGBTQ+ organizations operate in a legal gray zone. Pride events are held, then quietly canceled. Social media posts vanish overnight. Progress steps forward, then side-eyes itself, unsure whether to keep walking. Still you see them. The couples strolling along the Bund, their fingers brushing just enough to say, "I'm here." The students quoting ancient poems that mean more than their professors realize. The elders who never said the words out loud, but smile a little differently when someone else does. Their stories didn't die. They were just never printed. And the history, it was always there. It lived in the scrolls they told you not to read too closely, in the side notes of magistrates, in the margins of official records. It lived in lacquered boxes, in whispered names, in poems that never quite made sense until you read them again, a little slower, a little more openly. Even today, you'll find museums displaying ancient bronze mirrors inscribed with lines like, "Together forever, hearts aligned." No one says what kind of couple they were meant for. But maybe that's the point. Maybe ancient China, for all its contradictions, left space for ambiguity not out of cowardice, but as quiet resistance. As if to say, you'll know if it's meant for you. And maybe that's why people are shocked when they hear the full story. They assume same-sex love is a modern invention, a Western import, a trend. But it isn't. It's been here underfoot overhead, stitched into the walls for over 2,000 years. The emperor's bed, the scholar's brush, the monk's silence, the actor's blush, the porter's shared rice bowl, all part of the same unspoken story. Even today, when queer life in China faces pressure from all sides, legal, cultural, digital, there's something deeply resilient about it. It doesn't just survive. It adapts. It jokes. It dances. It remembers. And sometimes it slips into ancient metaphors because it knows those old stories never fully disappeared. They were just waiting for someone to listen again. So as you leave this journey behind, dusty scrolls, cut sleeves, painted faces, and all know this, the past doesn't just echo. It guides. And those moments of love you've seen weren't footnotes. They were the text, the main story, the part we were always meant to find. And maybe someone in the future will look back at today, your time, your stories, and whisper, so it never ended. It only changed form. You glance at the stream winding through the edge of your town, and even though the sunlight makes it sparkle, you know better than to drink from it. There's no mystery about why. You've seen what happens to people who forget fevers, vomiting days of misery in bed, if they're lucky. And if they're not lucky, you watch the gravedigger make another trip. Even in cities like York or Paris, people have learned to be cautious. A sip of untreated water could turn an ordinary day into your last one. Because in the Middle Ages, water isn't the clean, filtered, ice-cold drink you might think it should be. It's unpredictable. It can look clear and still carry the runoff from tanneries, human waste, and animal droppings. It's the public bath, the laundry site, the latrine overflow, and the neighborhood trash chute all rolled into one trickling mess. And though people might not use words like bacteria or cholera, they figured it out in the most brutal way. Drink that, and you're taking a risk. So you don't. You drink ale, and no, it's not the kind of ale that gets you singing and stumbling through the streets. This is what people call small beer. Low in alcohol, mild in taste, and served all day long. You drink it in the morning. You drink it during work. You drink it at dinner. Even children drink it, because what else are they going to do? Sip river water and pray. The reason it's safer isn't just luck. Brewing involves boiling, and boiling kills off what you can't see. Fermentation keeps the liquid from turning rancid. In short, brewing transforms something dangerous into something trustworthy. No microscope is needed, just history. Generations of trial and error have taught everyone, if you want to stay upright, drink what's been brewed. And this isn't just for peasants. In places like London or Ghent, people of all classes drink ale or wine. Travelers passing through villages stop at inns and drink the local brew rather than touch the well. And in port cities like Lubeck or Bristol, barrels of ale are shipped as cargo to supply crews and customers alike, because if you're going to spend weeks at sea, you'd rather not rely on barrels of water that could spoil halfway through. Even well water, which sounds safer, isn't a guarantee. In towns, wells are often shallow and too close to cesspits or animal pens. You draw water with a rope and hope it doesn't smell off. In cities, the situation can be worse. One poor location or one bad storm can flood a well with contaminants from the street. So again, people brew. By the 14th century, brewers become as vital as bakers. Some towns like Bruges or Cologne have entire guilds dedicated to brewing. And in England, the job of ale conner is created. It's a public official whose task is to inspect the quality of ale being sold. They walk from stall to stall, tavern to tavern, tasting every batch. If it's too weak or too strong, too foul or too expensive, they issue warnings or fines. You might not have a doctor in your village, but you've got someone making sure your drink won't destroy your insides. Meanwhile, monasteries become centers of large-scale brewing. Monks in places like the Abbey of St. Gall in modern-day Switzerland, or the Benedictine houses in France, produce ale not only for themselves, but for local communities and pilgrims. Brewing is part of their routine, part of their service, and frankly, part of their survival strategy. Monks fast often, and during long fasts, liquid nutrition is allowed. Beer becomes a form of sustenance, not just refreshment. The church also plays another role in the medieval drinking world. Wine. In Catholic Europe, wine is sacred. It's used in Mass, symbolizing the blood of Christ. But beyond ritual, it's a regular part of the diet, especially in Southern Europe, where grapes grow more easily. In cities like Florence or Avignon, even the poor might stretch their wine with water, ironic, really, considering how dangerous that water can be. But again, the alcohol makes it safer than drinking the water on its own. In fact, in regions where wine is common, such as the Mediterranean coast, it often becomes the drink of choice. Northern Europe leans toward beer. But the logic is the same. Alcohol means security. You're not chasing a buzz, you're dodging a funeral. So by now, it's no longer strange to you. You've poured your third cup of the day, and it's barely noon. You're not drunk, and no one expects you to be. You're just trying to live another day without finding out the hard way what's floating in the river. And tomorrow, you'll do the same thing. Because in a world where the water might betray you, ale never does. You wake up with the sound of hooves in the distance and the low hum of morning life beginning to stir. The air is cool, the straw beneath your back still itchy, and your first instinct is not to stretch but to drink. And what you reach for isn't water, it's beer. Weak pale, slightly sour, and barely alcoholic. But it does the job. It wakes you up, settles your stomach, and gives you something safe to sip as you plan the day ahead. Breakfast beer. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But in the medieval world, it's as normal as a slice of bread. And in fact, the bread and beer often come from the same source grain. Your food is heavy on barley oats and rye. So why not your drink too? You need calories, and booze is one of the most efficient ways to get them. Not in the sense of getting drunk, but in the sense of staying fueled. Throughout your day, you drink more. Mid-morning while helping with the sheep. Noon when the sun is directly overhead and your back is aching. Afternoon as you patch a leaking roof or sweep out the stall. And again with your evening meal. Ale, wine if you're lucky. The rhythm never breaks. It's not treated like a treat or a vice, it's your hydration plan. Even children drink with you. And no one blinks. Because this is small beer, the kind brewed with less grain, fermented for a short time, and clocking in somewhere around 1% to 2% alcohol. It's not designed to make you dizzy. It's designed to be boiled, stored, and kept safe. Safer than water. Safer than milk, even because unpasteurized milk turns quickly, and your goats might catch a disease you won't know how to name, let alone cure. In a town like Bruges or Ghent, or even smaller villages tucked behind stone walls and muddy roads, the tavern isn't a place you go to get wild. It's just where you drink. It's part of the daily circuit. A farmer drops in before sunrise for a cup. A merchant stops mid-morning. A local boy, tired from lifting bales, gets a mug and sips it slowly while scratching at his hay-filled hair. These aren't celebrations. They're pit stops, and the options vary by class. If you're wealthy, say a wool merchant in London, or a night back from campaign you might have imported wine from Bordeaux, or a strong mead steeped with honey and herbs. But for most people, it's ale. Home-brewed thick sometimes, cloudy served from wooden buckets or old ceramic jugs. It's not fancy, but it keeps you standing. Even religious institutions often thought of as places of restraint follow the same habits. In the monasteries of Cluny-Citeaux or Westminster Abbey, records show barrels upon barrels of beer consumed by monks. And this isn't occasional indulgence. It's built into the routine. Monks rise before dawn for prayers, break fast with ale, and repeat the process throughout the day. Brewing is often done on site, with monks tracking ingredients, measurements, and fermentation times with almost scientific precision. Because once you understand that beer is food and medicine, the volume starts making sense. In parts of England, it's not unusual for a working adult to drink a gallon or more of ale a day. That's not binge drinking. That's survival. And when food is scarce, or when Lent comes around and solid meals disappear, beer becomes more than a drink. It becomes your substitute meal. There's even a hierarchy in booze. Strong ale is reserved for special occasions, weddings, harvest festivals, church feasts. If you're drinking something strong during the work week, people will notice. They'll raise an eyebrow. What's the occasion? Did someone die? Are you sick? Are you celebrating a birth? Stronger alcohol carries social weight. It says something is happening. But your daily brew, that's as neutral as the mud on your boots. Now picture yourself helping with a building project. A new granary roof, maybe, or a shared fence. You and half the village are lifting, pounding, grunting. And what's passed around? Not water. Never water. It's beer. Warm, often flat, sometimes laced with herbs or fruit scraps. But it's liquid energy. And it's shared like bread, freely, openly, as part of the communal labor. Even city workers, carpenters in Prague, masons in Florence, coopers in York, often get part of their wages in beer. Employers provide it as part of the contract. You show up, swing a hammer, and someone hands you a mug before noon. That's not a break. It's an expectation. And no one bats an eye because no one wants a dehydrated craftsman passing out on a scaffold. The idea of booze as something reserved for evenings or weekends or celebrations that belongs to a later world. In your world, you drink because you must. Because the alternative might put you in the churchyard by the end of the week. Because your ancestors learned the hard way that the stream can lie. And so you drink. Not for pleasure, not for escape, just for fuel. You crouch beside the hearth, stoking the embers to get the brewing pot warm again. The smell of damp grain clings to your hands, and steam curls lazily from the lip of the iron kettle. It's brew day again. You do this every few days, not because you're chasing a hobby, but because this is how your household survives. Buying from the alewife down the road would cost too much. Trusting the stream outside the fence isn't an option. So you do what most families in your village do. You brew your own. Because here's a simple truth you've learned without needing a lecture from some university in Bologna. Brewing is cheaper and safer than trusting nature. The process doesn't need complex tools, just grain, water, and fire. You boil the mix, cool it, add yeast, if you're lucky enough to know what that is. Most just use the foam, scraped off an older batch, kept alive like a secret pet. Then you wait. A few days later, your household has another few gallons of drinkable, preservable liquid. It's a domestic rhythm, like kneading bread or patching a tunic. The tools are humble: an old pot, a stirring stick, a sieve made from cloth and patience. You save the spent grain to feed the pigs or throw it in a stew. Nothing goes to waste because everything costs something, even your time. And the alternative, buying drink from the market, isn't always appealing. Prices shift. The quality depends on the brewer's mood or the state of their barrels or whether rats got into the grain last week. You've tasted sour ale before, the kind that makes your teeth hurt and your stomach lurch. Once a neighbor tried selling a batch that had gone moldy. He swore it just had a little kick. People remember that. His stall has been quiet ever since. So you stick to your own process. You know where the water comes from. A covered barrel you fill carefully from a deep, hand-dug well lined with stones and far from the latrine. You know where the grain came from, harvested from the southern field, stored in your loft, free of rot and pests at least this time. And you know how long you let it ferment, never too short, or it tastes like swamp water. Never too long, or it sneaks up on you by mid-afternoon. In towns and cities, brewing is more organized. You hear of entire streets, in places like Nuremberg or Norwich, where brewers dominate the real estate. They mark their doors with branches or signs to show ale is ready. You can smell it before you see it. The earthy, sour scent of grain boiling and sugar breaking down. And you know the rules there are stricter. Brewers pay taxes, follow regulations, compete for customers. But in your world, it's personal. You brew for your family, for your neighbors, sometimes for barter. No one sues you if the ale's too strong. They just complain and come back next week anyway. And still, even with all the risk and mess, it beats trusting raw nature. Water isn't always deadly sure. There are springs that stay clean, rivers that run fast enough to carry off the filth. But those are rare and temporary. A good well today might sour tomorrow. A clean stream might flood next week and drag the contents of a nearby cemetery into your drinking supply. You don't gamble with that. Not when brewing is an option. Even the seasonal rhythm favors brewing. In the warmer months, water grows more dangerous. Heat breeds disease. Stagnant puddles become breeding grounds. But beer, it stays stable. It stores well in cool cellars. You keep it in barrels, bottles if you're lucky, clay pots sealed with wax if you're careful. If the harvest was good, you might even brew enough to last through winter. Just don't forget to keep the firewood dry, or there'll be no boiling and no beer. And though no one calls you a scientist, there's a kind of wisdom in your method. You don't just pour things together and hope. You observe, adjust. A too quick boil changes the flavor. A too cold fermentation yields nothing but disappointment. It's not written in books, but you know it in your bones. There's also pride in the process. When someone drinks your brew and nods with approval, it's not just relief, it's achievement. They trust what you made. They believe it won't make them ill. That's no small thing in a world where sickness lurks behind every meal. So you keep going. You brew because it's safer, because it's smart, because it's something within your control when the rest of the world often isn't. And as you pour a small sample into a wooden cup, the scent familiar and comforting, you remember nature might be wild, but your kettle doesn't lie. The church bells toll across the valley, echoing over fields still damp with morning mist. You pause for a moment, mug in hand, and listen as the iron voice calls the faithful. You finish your drink ale as usual and make your way toward the chapel. Inside, the candles flicker, the incense clings to the rafters, and the priest stands robed and ready. In his hand, a goblet. And what's in it? Wine. Yes, the very same church that preaches moderation and warns against temptation regularly serves alcohol, blessed alcohol no less. Because in this world, even your salvation comes in fermented form. You kneel at the altar and open your mouth to receive communion. The wafer melts away almost instantly, and the sip of wine that follows is tiny but unmistakable. It's not meant to refresh. It's meant to transform. The wine becomes the blood of Christ, at least that's what the priest says. And whether you believe it literally or symbolically, one thing is clear: alcohol is divine. But this isn't just a symbolic ritual tucked away in holy corners. The church itself is one of the largest producers and consumers of alcohol in the medieval world. Monasteries across Europe, Cluny in France, Westminster in England, and Fulda in Germany own vineyards, operate breweries, and maintain massive cellars stacked with barrels of wine and ale. You might think monks live in silence and hardship, but many of them live surrounded by bubbling vats and foaming barrels. Take the Cistercians, for instance. Their devotion to hard work includes agriculture, architecture, and yes, brewing. They experiment with flavors, improve methods, and sometimes even sell their surplus. At the Abbey of St. Gall, records show detailed instructions for brewing beer and maintaining wine presses. It's not some hidden indulgence. It's structured, sacred, standard. And this isn't isolated. In southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, monasteries are known for cultivating grapes and producing wine strong enough to store, ship, and sell. In northern Europe, especially in regions too cold for good vineyards, monks become masters of beer. And not just for themselves, they offer it to pilgrims, sell it to locals, and provide it during fasts when food is limited, but drink isn't. You see, monastic fasting isn't what you think. When solid food is off the table, monks often increase their consumption of liquid bread. Beer made with extra grain, hearty, filling, nutrient-rich. A mug of that, and you can skip dinner without collapsing during evening prayer. You might think this creates a double standard, and maybe it does, but the logic is consistent with medieval thinking. Alcohol, when used correctly, is a tool of God. It nourishes, purifies, and comforts. Misused, it becomes a sin. But then again, so does everything in this world, if taken too far. The trick is knowing where the line is, and preferably standing just behind it with a mug in hand. Even the higher clergy aren't exempt. Bishops often receive wine shipments as part of their land revenues. Monasteries store barrels as tithes. Monks keep logs of who drank what, when, and why. And if you peek into the kitchens of certain abbeys, you'll find brewing equipment more advanced than anything in the village outside. And yet not all monks are content with moderation. Throughout history, there are mutterings of overindulgence. Some monks drink more than their share. Some hoard the stronger stuff for feast days. Some even trade casks under the table, literally and figuratively, but no one pretends it doesn't happen. Because alcohol isn't taboo here, it's part of the fabric. Even religious celebrations, saints' days, harvest feasts, holy vigils are soaked in drink. You go to Mass in the morning, then join the revelry outside. The church sponsors food, drink, music, and dancing. Sometimes the entire village joins in. And the drink flows freely, because what better way to honor the blessings of God than with joy? And what better joy than a full mug? It's not just about pleasure either. The church understands logistics. Wine and ale store better than grain or milk. They travel more safely. They nourish during lean months. And they can be taxed, gifted, and exchanged with ease. In a world built on faith and uncertainty, fermented drink becomes a sacred currency. And so as you leave the chapel and walk back into the sunlit square, your lips still tingling faintly from the communion wine, you don't feel conflicted. You feel balanced. The same drink that warms your stomach at dinner now rests in your soul. The same hands that pray also pour. The same monks who chant psalms also check fermentation barrels at dawn. And in that blend of sacred and simple, you begin to see it clearly here. In the heart of medieval life, alcohol isn't just survival. It's a spiritual practice. You pass under the hanging sign of the local tavern, a creaky wooden board swaying in the wind, marked by the worn image of a boar, or maybe a barrel. It's hard to tell anymore. Inside, it smells like yeast smoke and sweat. Not unpleasant, just lived in. You nod to the innkeeper, step over a snoring regular, and squeeze your way onto a bench near the fire. This isn't just a place to drink. It's your news feed, your bulletin board, your office water cooler, and let's be honest, your entertainment center. Because in a medieval town, the tavern is the social hub, not the church, not the market square. Here, amid the clatter of mugs and the muttering of gossip, real connections happen. You learn who's hiring laborers, who's been fined by the local reeve, whose pigs got into whose cabbage patch. People speak freely here, too freely sometimes, and the ale tends to loosen lips just enough to make stories worth hearing. You sip your drink, probably the house ale, dark and flat, but comfortingly familiar, and settle in. Across the room, a group of journeymen argue over coin, while a merchant from out of town counts coppers by candlelight. A bard tunes his lute in the corner, preparing to play something that will either delight or drive you into the street, depending on how much he's had to drink. You're not alone in treating this place like a second home. People meet here to settle disputes, arrange marriages, even hold informal trials. Sure, the lord of the manor handles the big stuff, but plenty of issues are solved over drinks, especially if the right people are present. You've seen it, two farmers shouting over land rights on Monday, shaking hands over ale by Tuesday. And while you're there, it's hard not to notice how many deals are sealed with drink, literally. A tenant agrees to pay his rent, late one round for the landlord. A carpenter offers to mend a neighbor's shutters, buy him a mug, and the deal is struck. In a world where parchment is expensive and few can read anyway, handshakes and shared drinks stand in for contracts, and not just in villages. In cities like Lubeck, Bruges, or London, taverns are where merchants negotiate trade routes and sailors swap maps and rumors. Some even have private booths, like little wooden confessionals where merchants whisper secrets and slide coins across the table. No one trusts anyone entirely, but get a man halfway through a strong ale, and he just might reveal where the next wool shipment's headed. Even the town criers and messengers frequent taverns, sometimes dropping a nugget of royal news in exchange for a hot meal or a free cup. You keep your ears open. You've learned that who's drinking with who often tells you more than what's shouted in the streets. And yes, there's music. Sometimes good, sometimes truly tragic. The bard starts playing now a song you've heard a dozen times before, about a maiden, a knight, and a horse that somehow speaks. But no one really minds the repetition. Familiar tunes go down smoother when paired with familiar drinks. They soften the edges of a hard week. Remind you of stories you half believe and heroes who probably never existed. You know, some people criticize taverns. The sermons say they tempt you to sloth, gluttony, and lewdness. And sure, sometimes they do. But they also serve a purpose. They give people warmth when their hearth is cold. They offer companionship when fields stretch too wide and silent. They are places of laughter in a life where laughter is rationed. And for those who don't own much, who work all day with aching hands and muddy boots, the tavern offers dignity. Here with a mug in hand, you're not a peasant or a servant or a widow. You're just a voice among voices, a story among stories. You get to be part of something bigger, if only for an hour. Some people even fall in love here. Though you roll your eyes at the idea, still it happens. A glance over a table, a shared bench, a slurred confession that accidentally sounds poetic. The tavern's not exactly romantic, but it's where people are real, unpolished, honest in their own crooked way. And yes, sometimes it goes sideways. A spilled drink turns into a shove. A bad hand of dice leads to bruises. A man drinks too much and forgets his name, let alone his way home. But somehow, the place keeps going. The tables get scrubbed. The ale barrels are replaced. The bard shows up again, one string short, but smiling. So you sit and sip and listen. Because in this loud, smoky, half-lit room, you're not just passing time. You're participating in a system as old as bread. Booze and talk. Drink and deal. Mugs instead of memos. A song instead of a scroll. No one here will write history, but they'll live it one ale at a time. Outside, the air is beginning to rot with autumn. The apples are softening on the branch, the pears bruising in the baskets, and the leftover grain. Well, it's not going to last much longer. You can already smell the sour edge of the barley, the damp settling into the sacks. And you know what that means, time to brew. Again. Because here booze isn't just a drink, it's preservation. You watch your neighbors haul in the last of the harvest. Crates of fruit, sacks of rye, and oats, armfuls of herbs tied with string. None of it will stay fresh for long. You don't have freezers. You don't even have glass jars. Your choices are drying, smoking, salting, or turning perishables into something liquid, stable, and pleasantly intoxicating. And so, you get to work. The shriveled apples from the edge of the orchard, crush them. Add some honey if you have it. Set the juice in a cask and let it bubble. A month from now, you've got cider. The wild blackberries your children collected in stained baskets, boil them, strain them, let the mixture sit beside the fire. In a few weeks, it will be wine. Cloudy, sour, slightly gritty, but far better than letting them rot in the corner of the pantry. Even the spare wheat no longer good for bread can be mashed into wort and brewed into ale. Maybe it's weaker than your best batch. Maybe it ferments too fast, but it's still safer and more useful than spoiled grain in a mouse-ridden sack. This is how you survive winter. You drink what summer and fall leave behind. You preserve the energy of sunshine and soil in bottles and barrels. And when the snow comes and the roads close and your pantry shrinks to dry beans and cheese rinds, you still have something sweet to sip. Something to remind you that warmth once existed. In fact, entire households plan their brewing schedules around harvest cycles. Brewing isn't random, it's calculated. You brew heavily when fruit peaks. You double your efforts when grain prices drop. You make strong ale in late summer, so it lasts into December. In some parts of Europe, the best brewers are known not for their ingredients, but their timing. And the equipment, it's nothing fancy. A copper kettle if you're lucky. A barrel made by the cooper next door sealed with pitch or wax. A cloth to strain. A spoon the size of a shovel. The technology hasn't changed in decades because it doesn't need to. What matters is instinct. You can tell by the smell when something's fermenting right. You know by the foam if a batch is alive or flat. Your nose and tongue are your most trusted tools. Even in cities where space is tight and everything smells like smoke and livestock, rooftop brewers turn fruit waste into drink. The scraps from the market, the bruised plums, overripe figs, squashed pears get bought cheap and turned into tavern wine. Not good wine, not the kind served at a noble table, but the kind that warms a laborer's belly and lets him forget his sore back for an hour. And in monasteries, they plan their production down to the last grape. The vineyards around Cluny-Reichenau and Monte Cassino stretch like carpets of gold. Nothing is wasted. Grapes too small for communion wine become table wine. Leftover skins are pressed again and again, watered down, and turned into a poor man's vintage. The monks know the value of every drop. They bottle it, store it, age it. Their cellars are cooler than the abbey's chapel. The same is true for beer. If the harvest is good, the beer will flow. If the harvest is poor, beer becomes precious. Taverns raise prices. Families ration mugs. Strong ale disappears from shelves. You drink what's left, and you drink it slow. Even taxes revolve around booze. In many towns, beer is taxed by the barrel. Wine is measured by the jug. The local lord collects his share, sometimes in coin, sometimes in drink. In fact, part of your rent might be paid in ale. A few gallons here, a promise of cider next month. Alcohol becomes currency. It holds value better than grain, travels better than meat, and survives poor weather better than both. And when everything else goes wrong, when the sheep fall ill, when the roof caves in, when the frost comes early, what do you reach for? Not water, not milk, but the cloudy bottle in the corner. The one that tastes like overripe cherries and smells like fermenting hope. Because medieval life is hard, but drink makes it manageable. Not just for escape, not just for comfort, but as a system. A method of storage, of stretching the good months into the lean ones. A way of saying, we may not have much, but we kept the summer in a bottle. And when you sit beside the fire mug in hand, snow against the shutters and stew on the coals, you don't feel rich. But you don't feel empty either. You've stored what mattered. And for tonight, at least the past tastes warm. You wipe your hands on your tunic, thick with dust and sweat, and glance at the low sun dipping behind the barn. Another long day. You've split wood, mended a gate, and helped thresh grain until your arms ached, and through it all, you've been just a little tipsy. Not drunk. Never that. But warm, relaxed. A slow buzz humming behind your ribs, taking the edge off the endless clatter of life. Because in the medieval world, you work with alcohol in your system. Everyone does. And nobody thinks it's strange. There's no rule against it. No workplace policy. No sign by the mill saying don't drink and grind. Booze is as much a part of your daily rhythm as sunrise. You don't even think about it. You drink ale with breakfast because you woke up thirsty. You take a mug to the fields because water turns sour. You have a sip mid-morning to keep your mouth from drying out. And by lunch, you're on your third. But this isn't about chasing pleasure. It's practical. When you're digging ditches, shaping timber, or herding sheep across rocky hills, you need hydration. You need calories. You need something that won't make you sick. And for centuries, that's been low alcohol ale. Enough to warm your belly, but not enough to make your hands shake. Small beer, they call it. Brewed for speed, not strength. It's made from second or third runnings of the mash, so it's weaker and thinner, but still fermented, still safe. You brew it in large batches and store it in jugs and barrels. Some tastes sour. Some tastes like damp wood and barley. Some, miraculously, tastes good. But all of it keeps your body moving. You've seen carpenters swinging hammers with mugs balanced on beams. Shepherds sipping as they watch the hills. Masons laying stones with tankards wedged into tool baskets. And somehow, the work gets done. Not always straight. Not always perfect. But done. And you've heard the jokes. That roof's as crooked as Thomas after 3 ales. Or if the bridge collapses, blame the brewer. But no one really blames the drink. They blame fate, the weather, bad luck. Because alcohol is part of the labor, not the problem. Even women working in fields or spinning wool at home keep a jug nearby. Children, too, drink the smallest beer, more like flavored water than anything else. Milk turns too fast. Water can't be trusted. But small beer, that's the household staple. And it blurs the line between nourishment and indulgence. If you're a laborer in the city, a cobbler, a tanner, a blacksmith, you might get part of your daily pay in drink. Literally. Some employers supply ale as part of the job. You show up, do your work, and drink as you go. It's a perk and an expectation. Refusing would be like turning down bread at dinner. It simply isn't done. But there's a difference between drink that fuels and drink that floors you. Everyone knows someone who tips too far. The man who sings loudly at noon and weeps by dusk. The one who trades tools for another round. Those people are warned, laughed at, or quietly avoided. No one wants to work beside a drunk, not because it's immoral, but because it's dangerous. Drunkenness is a personal failing. Drinking is a fact of life. And sometimes, of course, the line blurs. On feast days, when the ale is strong and the food is rich, even the steadiest hands go wobbly. You've had those evenings, when laughter spills into the streets, when torches glow against stone walls, and when someone inevitably tries to climb a cart or race a donkey. But the next morning, it's back to the weak stuff. Back to work. Back to steady hands and slow sips. The monasteries do it too. Monks are some of the most organized workers in the world. Scribes, gardeners, carpenters, copyists, and even they keep barrels of ale close by. Their drink is carefully rationed, sometimes 3 times a day, not just for pleasure, but for fasting, for strength, for habit. And in cities like Ghent, York, or Nuremberg, large guilds of tradesmen keep their own brew houses, not just to sell to the public, but to provide for their own members. Ale keeps workers from collapsing, and guilds know the value of keeping bellies full and spirits level. Some even write it into their rules, so many pints per day per man during labor. And in times of illness, when your joints ache and your skin burns, alcohol becomes both comfort and cure. A hot mug, a slug of wine, a bitter herbal brew soaked in beer. You drink to sleep. You drink to numb. You drink because there are no better options. And if the fever passes, thank the saints. If it doesn't, at least you didn't go dry. So you drink, while you hammer, while you sew, while you herd and carve and lift and plant, and no one stops you. Because in this world, you work with a mug in hand, and somehow, things still get built. You glance across the table and watch as a 5-year-old lifts a wooden mug to his lips and takes a careful sip. No one scolds him. No one gasps. No one even notices. Because in this world, children drink beer too, and no one finds it strange. That might sound shocking if you come from a time where juice boxes and milk cartons rule the schoolyard, but in medieval life, those simply aren't options. Milk spoils fast, and often comes from animals that aren't clean or healthy. Juice, only if someone crushed fresh fruit an hour ago. And water, as you've long since learned, is a game of intestinal roulette. So what do you give your child to drink? The same thing you give yourself small beer. It's not meant to intoxicate. In fact, the alcohol content is so low it barely qualifies, but it's boiled. It's fermented, and it won't kill your child, which frankly sets it leagues ahead of half the drinks available. So yes, Your toddler walks around the garden carrying a half-full mug, dribbling a bit of foam down their chin, and you don't worry. You're just glad they're hydrated. Small beer becomes part of growing up. Children drink it with meals, carry it to the fields, and sometimes even help brew it. They learn the smells, the timing, the signs of a good batch. In many households, teaching a child to help with brewing is as natural as teaching them to bake or mend. It's a survival skill, not a luxury. And this isn't just in the countryside. In towns and cities, the pattern holds. Market stalls sell mugs of weak ale to children running errands. Apprentices, some as young as 7, drink beer as part of their midday break. No one questions it. There are no age restrictions. No whispered judgments. It's simply normal. You remember the time a child fell ill after drinking from an uncovered well. The family had run out of ale, thought just one drink from the bucket would be harmless. The fever started the next morning. They buried him by the end of the week. Stories like that stick. They reinforce what everyone already knows. It's not about indulgence, it's about safety. In wealthier homes, the pattern continues, but with a twist. Children of noble families might be given watered-down wine instead of beer. In southern France or Italy, that's the go-to. They mix the wine with water, sometimes adding herbs, sometimes heating it up. But again, the reason is the same: safety and digestion. And maybe just a little status. You see it even in monasteries that care for orphaned children or young novices. They don't serve water. With meals, they serve weak ale or grape must. The records from abbeys like Cluny and Monte Cassino show detailed notes on the rations of beer and wine provided to each age group. It's managed, measured, intentional. Because everyone young or old needs safe hydration. Of course, not all parents are perfect. You've seen some let their children sip stronger drink than they should. A mug passed too often at a feast, a neglected toddler grabbing from a half-full jug. But even then, the concern isn't usually about alcohol content. It's about manners. Don't take without asking. Don't spill. The scolding focuses on behavior, not the drink itself. And it's not all small beer. In some regions, especially during colder months, children are given warm ale, mixed with herbs. Rosemary, sage, a bit of honey, if it's a good day. It's a remedy for coughs, chills, upset stomachs. You've had it yourself, steaming in a clay cup, your mother blowing on it gently before handing it over. The bitterness still lingers in memory, but so does the comfort. In some parts of Northern Europe, even brewers design certain batches with children in mind, extra light, barely fermented, flavored with fruit or herbs. Not because children are fussy drinkers, but because parents want to make sure they stay healthy. When your options are few, you become creative. And as children grow older, the line between small beer and stronger ale begins to blur. By adolescence, most are drinking what the adults do, in the same amounts at the same times. There's no ceremony, no rite of passage, just a quiet shift. One day, they're drinking to hydrate. The next, they're drinking to relax after labor. And through it all, no one ever calls it dangerous. Because when you live in a world surrounded by plague, hunger, injury, and war, a little beer is the least of your concerns. No one talks about addiction because there are no therapists. No one worries about drunk driving because there are no carts fast enough to matter. The dangers are elsewhere. This is just part of growing up. So when you see the child at the table lifting a mug to his mouth, you don't panic. You nod. Because you know what's in that mug. You brewed it yourself. The morning light creeps across the dirt floor of your cottage, catching the rim of an empty mug still sitting by the hearth. Your head is heavy, your mouth dry, but you're not alone. Across the village, across every village, people are waking up like this, blinking at the sun through aching eyes, stretching limbs sore from labor and drink alike. It's not a mystery why. You were celebrating last night, or forgetting, or just trying to make it through another cold, relentless day, and no one judges you. Because in this world, a hangover is nothing compared to everything else that might go wrong. The truth is, medieval life is hard. Not hard in the poetic noble quest kind of way, but hard in the your child has a cough and might not survive winter kind of way. In the you worked for 12 hours and might not get paid kind of way. You spend every day worrying about things far more urgent than a pounding head or a stomach that turns at the smell of stew. Booze becomes part of how you cope. Not as an escape exactly, but as a buffer. A way to soften the sharp edges of life. You lose a cow drink, your neighbor's roof caught fire drink. The harvest came in light again. Drink, pray, and drink some more. In some cases, drinking is the only available medicine. If you get an injury, cut yourself with a scythe, or twist your ankle in the field, what do they give you? A cloth soaked in wine, a gulp of mead, maybe a prayer. And that's it, because alcohol is the strongest thing in your world. No morphine, no aspirin, just liquid painkiller. And still, the hangover isn't the worst part. The worst part is knowing the next day holds the same trials. You still have to work, still have to cook, clean, dig, sew, care for children. Listen to the bailiff, endure the gossip, avoid the tax collector, dodge illness. A hangover is a headache. Life is a hammer. So you get up, you drink some weak beer with your breakfast, and you start again. In towns, it's the same. You've seen men stumble into the alley behind a tavern at dawn, rinse their faces with rainwater caught in barrels, and head straight to the workshop. The blacksmith doesn't pause. The baker doesn't blink. Everyone's seen it. Everyone's done it. And it's not limited to the poor. Even nobles suffer the same cycle. In castles, feasts last late into the night. Goblets of wine tankards, of ale pitchers of spiced mead passed from hand to hand. In the morning, the same noble might ride out red-eyed and silent, clutching his stomach behind layers of velvet and chainmail. There's no class immunity to consequence. You've heard whispers of the chronic drinkers, the ones who never seem to sober up, who stop working, stop speaking clearly, start seeing things. People shake their heads. Some say it's demons. Others say it's punishment. But no one says, stop drinking altogether. That would be like saying, stop eating bread. The idea is absurd, because you know what's worse than a hangover dysentery. Starvation, watching someone fade from a simple fever, or a winter that drags into May. Compared to that, a sore head is a luxury, something to be joked about, nursed, walked off. And people do joke. The local priest might grumble about demon drink, but he has his own small cask in the rectory. The alewife shakes her head at the stumblers, but pours the next round. You might get a warning from your wife, or a sharp look from your neighbor, but no one calls it a scandal. Not unless you forget to feed the animals. Not unless you fall into the well. Not unless you really mess up. In many places, there aren't even words for what you might call alcoholism. There's no diagnosis, just reputation. People know who's reliable and who isn't, who can handle drink and who goes too far. And the line isn't drawn by morality. It's drawn by productivity. If you can still work, still contribute, still function, you're fine. If not, the community adjusts around you or pushes you aside. And during festivals, all the rules blur. On feast days, saints' days, market days, midsummer, you expect to wake up dizzy. Everyone does. There's music, dancing, spit-roasted meat, and mugs passed hand to hand until the edges of the day go fuzzy. It's indulgence, yes, but also a kind of release valve. A way to let the pressure off before it explodes. Because pressure does build. Living under threat of war, of plague of famine, makes people brittle. You need moments to soften, to forget, to feel full. And sometimes that means drink. Even when you know tomorrow might be worse for it. So you rub your eyes, splash your face, drink something warm and weak and slightly bitter, and you get on with it. Because here in this life, the hangover is never the real problem. The night is quiet save for the soft creak of the rafters and the distant bark of a dog. You sit beside the hearth, the last log collapsing into glowing coals, and cradle a mug in your hands. This one's different, not your usual small beer, not the daily drink you use to stay hydrated or to take the edge off a long day. No, this is stronger, darker flavored with spices you only use on special occasions. It smells of cloves and honey and something deeper, something ancient. Because tonight, you're not just drinking to quench a thirst. You're drinking for reasons that stretch far beyond practicality. In the medieval world, booze isn't just water's safer cousin. It's medicine. It's myth. It's magic. Take that mug you're holding. In one town, it might be mulled ale to ease a winter cough. In another, it's a charm to ward off evil. Somewhere else, it's the first offering at a birth, a toast at a wedding, or a final sip before the grave. Alcohol doesn't just fill the belly, it fills roles no other substance can. You've heard your neighbors swear by the healing powers of certain drinks. Wine mixed with wormwood for stomach aches. Ale boiled with sage for sore throats. Mead steeped with thyme to fight off chills. The local midwife keeps her own stash bottles hidden in cloth, each labeled not with words, but with knots and scratches only she understands. And when someone's ill, what do they ask for? Not just prayers, not just poultices, but a bit of the strong stuff. In monasteries, the same holds true. Monks are some of the most careful and deliberate brewers in the land. They document their recipes, monitor fermentation, and adjust based on season and sickness. You've heard tales of herbal tonics brewed by Benedictines in northern Italy, or fiery elixirs prepared by Carthusians deep in the forests of France. These aren't drunken concoctions, they're medicine. In a world without antibiotics or reliable surgery, a bottle can be a lifeline. But the belief in alcohol's power doesn't stop at the physical. There's a layer of spiritual reverence, too. People speak of divine inspiration descending after a few mugs, of visions that arrive after drinking certain meads. Even the Norse sagas tell of sacred brews that gave warriors strength, wisdom, and prophecy. Odin himself was said to sip from magical vessels before facing great trials. You're no Viking, but the stories stick. And then there are the local superstitions. A glass left out overnight to please the spirits. A barrel blessed before winter to ensure it doesn't sour. Ale poured on grave mounds to honor the dead. Not everyone believes these things, but no one dares disrespect them either, just in case. You've seen people drink for courage, a shot before confessing something difficult, a mug before asking for a daughter's hand, a deep swallow before stepping onto a battlefield or into a courtroom or through the door of someone who may not forgive you. In those moments, it's not about the alcohol, it's about the ritual. Because drinking in the Middle Ages isn't just physical, it's deeply emotional. It marks the turning points, the beginnings, the endings, the thresholds between fear and hope, sorrow and laughter. You've cried into a cup more than once. You've also laughed until your ribs hurt, drink sloshing down your chin, tears mixing with foam. And that, too, is part of the story. Even the way people speak of their brews reflects this depth. A strong ale is called heart sharp. A good wine warms the soul. A bitter beer teaches patience. These aren't just descriptions. They're reflections of how much drink is woven into the fabric of life, into the language, the medicine, the mood. And as you finish the last sip, sweet spice slow, you don't feel drunk. You feel settled, like you've touched something old and shared, like you've participated in a tradition that stretches across time and place, from the vineyards of southern France to the barley fields of the Low Countries, from the hidden monastery cellars to the battered cups passed around a smoky village table. This is why medieval people drank. Not because they were reckless, not because they didn't know better, but because they did know better. They knew that drink could carry them through a hard winter, could disinfect a wound, could preserve a memory, could keep a child from falling sick, could comfort a soul on its worst day, or turn an ordinary evening into something worth remembering. And so you rinse your mug. You bank the fire. You lie down on the straw-stuffed mattress and close your eyes. Behind your eyelids, the flicker of candlelight still dances. The warmth of drink lingers soft and slow. You'll rise tomorrow, brew again, sip again, work again. But tonight you sleep full and just a little buzzed. As you drift beneath your blanket, let the crackle of the hearth and the quiet hum of memories settle around you. You've walked through muddy fields, stood in smoky taverns, watched barrels bubble with the weight of survival. Now you understand booze in the Middle Ages wasn't about excess. It was a way to live to last, to soften the edges of a harsh and uncertain world. Ale was water you could trust. Wine was warmth you could share. A mug in your hand meant you were still here, still trying. So sleep now, knowing that even centuries ago, people faced their fears with simple tools, bread fire, and drink. You're not so different from them. Your world may be cleaner, brighter, more explained, but in quiet moments like this, we all seek the same comfort. Close your eyes. Let history hold you. You're safe. You're full. You're home. And the night is long and kind.